There is an island in the South Pacific where almost everyone you meet has the exact same great-great-grandfather. He arrived here with 3 wives, wrote a set of rules for how his family should live, and died more than 125 years ago. And yet, right now, on that same island, his descendants are still following those rules. The island itself doesn't even legally belong to a government. It belongs, quite literally, to his family. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how one man built an entire society from nothing and why it's still standing. Let's take a closer look. This is Palmerston Island, a tiny coral atoll in the Cook Islands, roughly 500 kilometers from Rarotonga, the nearest significant town. There's no airstrip here, no regular boat service, just a ring of small islets around a turquoise lagoon, home to some of the most unusual family history anywhere in the Pacific. Stay with me until the end, because the reason this island works the way it does traces back to one specific decision made by one specific man over a century and a half ago, and it's still shaping every single relationship on the island today. Captain James Cook charted this atoll in 1774 and finally set foot on it in 1777, finding it uninhabited except for a scattering of ancient graves, evidence that people had lived here before and left, long before Europeans ever arrived. Cook named it after Lord Palmerston, a British Admiralty official, and for nearly a century afterward, the island remained essentially unclaimed, visited occasionally, but never permanently settled. That changed in 1863, when an English ship's carpenter and barrel maker named William Marsters arrived, having been hired to produce copra and collect sea cucumber for a Tahitian trader who, as it turned out, never came back for him. Rather than treat this as abandonment, Marsters made a decision that would define the island for generations. He decided to stay permanently and build a life here. He arrived with 2 Polynesian wives. A third would join later, and set about doing something remarkably deliberate for a stranded trader on an empty atoll. He began raising a family large enough to eventually populate the entire island. By the time he died in 1899, William Marsters had fathered 23 children and left behind 134 grandchildren, an almost unbelievable legacy for one man on one small piece of coral in the middle of the ocean. Today, every person still living on Palmerston, with only a couple of exceptions, is a direct descendant of that one man. And the way he chose to organize his family before he died didn't just shape the island's population. It shaped, in ways that persist to this very day, exactly how the island is governed, who can marry whom, and who actually owns the land beneath everyone's feet, which is exactly where this story goes next. Palmerston's isolation isn't a minor inconvenience. It's close to absolute. The atoll sits roughly 500 kilometers northwest of Rarotonga, the administrative center of the Cook Islands, across open ocean with no scheduled transportation connecting the two. There is no airstrip on Palmerston. There has never been one. The only ways to reach the island are an occasional cargo ship from Rarotonga, arriving just a handful of times a year, or a private yacht willing to make the crossing during the right season. For most of the island's history, that isolation was even more extreme than it is now. Palmerston's exact location wasn't properly fixed on official maps until 1969. For nearly 2 centuries after Cook first charted it, ships were navigating based on coordinates that satellite positioning later confirmed were off by roughly 10 miles. An island this remote had, quite literally, been slightly lost for generations. Modern technology has narrowed that isolation only slightly. A single satellite dish provides the island's only permanent link to the outside world. And even now, internet access is limited to certain hours and, according to residents, notoriously unreliable. There is no hospital, no permanent government office, nothing resembling the infrastructure most people would consider a baseline for modern life. It's the kind of isolation that would make it almost impossible for a random group of settlers to survive here long-term. But Palmerston was never populated by a random group of settlers. It was populated, deliberately and specifically, by one family. And understanding how that family actually sustains itself economically on an island this cut off from everything is where we're headed next. There is no cash economy on Palmerston in any conventional sense. With supply ships arriving only a few times a year and no reliable way to convert labor into regular income, residents live what outside observers consistently describe as a subsistence lifestyle, sustained primarily by fishing the abundant surrounding reef and by the coconut palms and pandanus that cover the atoll's islets, largely unchanged from how William Marsters himself would have fed his own growing family a century and a half ago. What limited cash does circulate on the island comes mostly from parrotfish exports and small-scale trade conducted through the infrequent cargo ships, along with support from family members who have relocated to Rarotonga, New Zealand, or Australia, where the vast majority of Marsters' descendants now actually live. The 30 or so residents on Palmerston today represent only a small fraction of a family that now numbers in the thousands across the Pacific. Because a genuine cash market is nearly impossible to sustain at this level of isolation, the cost of living here isn't really measured in currency at all. It's measured in what the ocean and the land directly provide, and how efficiently a small community can share those resources among the households that depend on them. Money, in the way most people understand it, is almost beside the point on Palmerston. That doesn't mean the island exists entirely outside a market economy, though. Visiting yachts, when they do arrive, often supplement the island's needs directly, trading supplies for fresh produce or handicrafts, an informal exchange system that has quietly filled some of the gap left by the near-total absence of a formal economy. But even this only works because of something else entirely unique to Palmerston. Exactly who is allowed to live here and how the island itself is actually owned. Palmerston's small population today divides into 3 distinct branches, each descended from one of William Marsters' 3 wives, Sarah, Tepu, and Matavia, all originally from the atoll of Tongareva. Before his death, Marsters made a decision that still shapes daily life on the island. He divided Palmerston's land into 3 sections, one allocated to each wife's descendants, a division that residents continue to recognize and respect generations later. This isn't simply a historical curiosity residents vaguely acknowledge, it's an active, functioning system. Island governance, land use, and significant elements of daily social life on Palmerston still run, in large part, along these 3 family lines, exactly as Marsters intended when he organized his family before his death in 1899. One rule in particular has outlasted almost everything else about the island's original founding. Marriage within the same family branch is prohibited. Anyone looking to marry has to find a partner from one of the other 2 branches, or increasingly, from off the island entirely. A rule Marsters is believed to have instituted specifically to prevent the kind of close intermarriage that a population this small, descended from one man, would otherwise risk within just a few generations. It's a remarkably sophisticated piece of social engineering for a stranded ship's carpenter to have devised in the 19th century, and it's one of the clearest examples of just how deliberately Marsters built the society his descendants still live in today. But it raises an obvious question. On an island with a population this small, split into 3 restricted branches, how does anyone actually find work or a life that doesn't involve leaving entirely? That's exactly where we're headed next. Here's the number that puts Palmerston's modern story in perspective. William Marsters' descendants today number in the thousands, scattered across Rarotonga, New Zealand, and Australia. Fewer than 3 or 4 dozen of them still actually live on the atoll itself. The overwhelming majority of this one man's family tree has, over 5 generations, simply left. The reasons are almost entirely practical. As Palmerston's population grew across the 20th century, the atoll's extremely limited land and resources came under real strain. There is only so much a coral atoll this small can sustainably support, no matter how efficiently its residents live off the reef and the palms. Younger generations, drawn by education, healthcare, and economic opportunities simply unavailable on an island without an airstrip or a cash economy, increasingly chose to relocate rather than remain. For many of those descendants, especially the children and grandchildren of people who left decades ago, Palmerston has become something closer to an ancestral homeland than an actual lived daily reality, a place their family comes from, rather than a place they expect to live. Some never make the journey back at all, given how difficult and infrequent transportation to the island remains even today. And yet the connection hasn't dissolved. Descendants living thousands of miles away still identify strongly with Palmerston, still trace their family tree back to William Marsters with real pride, and in some cases, still send support back to relatives who remain. That tension between a family that has mostly scattered and an island that a small, determined core has refused to abandon is really what keeps Palmerston functioning at all. And it explains something else important: exactly how anyone actually manages to visit an island this remote in the first place. Getting to Palmerston Island requires more deliberate effort than reaching almost anywhere else in the Pacific covered on this channel. There is no airstrip, and there has never been one. Any plan to fly to Palmerston simply doesn't exist. The most common way to reach the island is aboard one of the infrequent cargo ships that depart from Rarotonga, carrying supplies to the atoll only a handful of times each year. With no fixed public schedule, travelers can simply plan around. The alternative is arriving by private yacht, which is how many of the small number of visitors Palmerston does receive actually get there, typically during the calmer sailing season. Once a vessel arrives, visitors don't simply wander the island freely. By long-standing island custom, visits are coordinated through the Palmerston Island Administration, and new arrivals are formally greeted and hosted by a specific island family, a tradition passed down since the atoll was first settled. There is no tourism industry here in any conventional sense. No hotels, no restaurants, no organized excursions. Anyone who does make the difficult journey to Palmerston is, in a very real sense, a guest of the family that has run this island for 5 generations, not a customer of any commercial operation. That level of difficulty and formality keeps Palmerston almost entirely off the path of casual Pacific travel, which makes it all the more remarkable that a community this small, this hard to reach, and this thoroughly built around one man's personal legacy has managed to survive, structurally intact, for over a century and a half. A story that gets stranger the closer you look at exactly how Marsters organized things before he died. A handful of details about Palmerston tend to surprise people more than anything else about the island. Because William Marsters was English, and because his descendants have maintained the island in relative isolation from the rest of the mostly Polynesian-speaking Cook Islands, Palmerston today holds a genuinely unique linguistic distinction. It is the only island in the entire country where English is the native language, spoken with a distinct local accent and vocabulary shaped by 5 generations of isolation. Marsters himself has a name history nearly as unusual as his family's. He was actually born Richard Marsters, and for reasons that remain unclear even to his own descendants, adopted the name William Marsters at some point before permanently settling on the atoll, meaning the surname that now identifies an entire island community wasn't even the name its founder was born with. Bounty mutineers fleeing after their famous 1789 rebellion are recorded to have stopped briefly at Palmerston decades before Marsters ever arrived, according to a 19th century missionary's account, but decided the atoll wasn't quite what they were looking for and moved on, leaving it uninhabited for nearly a century longer before Marsters permanently settled it. And in a detail that captures the strange intimacy of daily life here, the very first resident to greet any visiting boat is, by island custom, treated as that visitor's official host for the duration of their stay. A tradition that means every single person who has ever properly visited Palmerston has a specific family and a specific personal connection, tying them to the island long after they've left it. Life on Palmerston. Today comes with a genuinely narrow margin for error. Fresh water is limited enough that residents rely heavily on rainfall capture rather than the island's natural groundwater, which is considered less reliable for drinking. Overfishing concerns have grown around the reef that has sustained the population for generations, an increasingly urgent issue for a community with essentially no alternative food source to fall back on. Medical care beyond the most basic level simply isn't available on the island. Any serious illness or injury means waiting for one of the infrequent supply ships or hoping a passing yacht can assist in a genuine emergency with no guarantee either will arrive quickly enough. It's a level of medical isolation that would be considered unacceptable risk almost anywhere else in the developed world, and yet it's simply the reality residents here have always lived with. The island's population also faces a demographic challenge with no easy solution. As younger generations continue to leave for opportunities in Rarotonga, New Zealand, and Australia, the core group willing to remain and sustain daily life on Palmerston keeps shrinking, raising real long-term questions about how many more generations the island can support any resident population at all. And underlying all of it is the same three-family marriage restriction that has protected the community's genetic health for 5 generations. A system that requires an ever-shrinking population to keep finding partners across family lines, or increasingly, from off the island altogether, just to keep the community itself sustainable in the most basic biological sense. Ask the small number of residents who've chosen to remain on Palmerston why they stay, and the answer almost always circles back to the same thing. This isn't simply where they live. It's the physical, literal proof of where their entire family came from. An island that exists in its current form, specifically because their great-great-grandfather decided to build something permanent out of nothing. There's a particular kind of responsibility that comes with being one of the few Marsters descendants who still actually lives on the ancestral land, rather than simply claiming descent from thousands of miles away. Residents who remain often describe themselves implicitly or explicitly as caretakers of something larger than their own individual lives, keeping alive not just a place, but a specific set of family customs, land divisions, and marriage rules that an ancestor wrote down more than a century ago, and that would simply cease to mean anything if nobody remained to actually follow them. That sense of custodianship connects directly to the single strangest fact about Palmerston, the one this entire video has been building toward since the very first line. Because unlike literally every other inhabited island in the Cook Islands, Palmerston isn't simply administered as government land with residents living on it. Its actual ownership traces back to one specific legal decision made decades after William Marsters died, and it's a detail that explains more than anything else in this video why the rules of one 19th century Englishman still genuinely govern this island today. It's time to finally tell you exactly what that is. In 1892, the British government granted William Marsters a 21-year lease to the island he had already been living on for nearly 3 decades. legal recognition of a kind for a claim he'd effectively been making simply by surviving there with his family. That lease was extended repeatedly over the following decades. And then, in 1954, New Zealand's Parliament passed an amendment to the Cook Islands Act that changed Palmerston's legal status permanently. Full ownership of the island was granted outright to William Marsters' descendants. This makes Palmerston genuinely unique among the 15 islands of the Cook Islands. It isn't simply inhabited by the Marsters family. It is, in the fullest legal sense, owned by them. Private family land within a national territory, governed day to day under the Palmerston Act of 1992, alongside the country's broader Outer Islands Act, but rooted at its core in a 19th century decision to formally recognize what one determined settler had already built. That ownership is exactly why the rules Marsters set down before his death in 1899 still carry real weight today. The three-family land division, the prohibition on marrying within your own branch, the tradition of formally hosting every visitor through a specific island family. None of these persist by government mandate or by any law passed in a distant capital. They persist because the island itself legally belongs to the very family whose founder wrote those rules in the first place, and because that family has simply kept choosing, generation after generation, to honor them. William Marsters died in 1899, reportedly of malnutrition, after blight destroyed the very coconut palms he'd spent decades planting to sustain the family he'd built from nothing. It's a genuinely difficult irony. The man who engineered an entire self-sufficient society on an empty atoll ultimately succumbed to the fragility of the same land he'd worked to make livable. But the family and the rules and the island itself all survived him. And more than a century later, they still belong, in every sense that matters, to the descendants of the three wives who came with him to build it. There's something quietly remarkable about a society built entirely from one man's determination not to simply survive being stranded, but to deliberately construct a permanent home, complete with rules meant to outlast him by generations. More than a century and a half later, most of that plan has scattered across the Pacific, living in Rarotonga, New Zealand, and Australia. But a small, determined handful have stayed exactly where he left them, on a coral atoll that legally, and quite literally, still belongs to his family. Maybe that's the real measure of what William Marsters actually built here. Not an island, a family that, against every reasonable expectation, simply refused to stop being one. If you find meaning in these forgotten coordinates, consider subscribing to the map. Together, we'll keep rescuing these places from the silence of history.